We have Jillian Ted who will be moderating our group. And we have with us Bill Rhodes, kind of a legendary figure. He wouldn't like that expression, but he is, going back many years in the business. And Jean-Claude Trichet, of course, you've heard him brilliantly an hour ago. I want to say that Bill, we're very proud of on the Bretton Woods Committee to have both Bill Rhodes and Jean-Claude Trichet as on our advisory council, which I think we just formed last year. And they've been very supportive of everything that this committee's doing. I should also say that Larry Summers, who is also obviously on the panel, our former Secretary of the Treasury, was a great supporter and constructive critic going back to the days when he was the Treasury Secretary, before he was Treasury Secretary, and since he's been Treasury Secretary. And we're delighted to have him back with us again. Jillian, it's your group.
Right. Well, thank you very much indeed. Is this microphone working? Great, okay, wonderful. Well, this is the third panel of the day, and it's what might be called the financial smorgasbord panel, with apologies to our Swedish central bank colleagues, because according to my list, we are supposed to discuss in 60 minutes the regional unrest and turmoil, the slow and anemic economic recovery, the debt overhangs, the inconsistencies of domestic structural banking reforms, normalization of accommodative monetary policy, cyber terrorism, and that's only a third of the list. But I think if we're going to tie this together, perhaps one way to frame this panel would be to try and talk about risks. Because the good news is that the dramatic crisis mentality and mode that was afoot as recently as 2 or 3 years ago has receded. The bad news is that nobody is quite relaxing yet. And so we have 3 esteemed speakers here who can share their perspectives on different parts of the world and from different public and private sector perspectives. So I think the real question overhanging this panel is, what do our speakers think is the biggest single risk that policymakers should be grappling with? What keeps them awake at night? And what, if anything, can we all collectively do about that? Now, this isn't a formal panel, it's more structured as a debate, but Larry Summers, Professor Summers, has brought us some homework to start off with. And so I'd like to perhaps start by asking Professor Summers to talk a bit about what you see as the biggest risk right now, with some slides I think you have prepared to accompany it. So the floor is yours for a few minutes, and then I'll turn to Jean-Claude Trichet and Bill Rhodes to then talk about some of the other risks that you are most worried about.
Fear not, only three graphs for you to see. The defining challenge of our time economically is secular stagnation. It is the risk of inadequate growth leading to inadequate potential, leading to inadequate growth, and a vicious cycle. Say's law is the false proposition that supply creates its own demand. An alternative formulation is that lack of demand creates its own lack of supply, and that is what we are seeing. This graph depicts successive estimates of potential GDP since 2007 and actual. Every year, actual falls far short of potential, and we revise downwards our view of what the economy is capable of in the United States. The picture is actually better in the United States than it is in Japan and Europe. If you look at the next slide. The next slide compares Europe since 2009 with Japan after 1992. And what you see is a quite common pattern. Major financial problems, containment of financial hemorrhaging, dismal growth, deflation, remarkably low interest rates, and a very poor growth prospect. Japan in 1997 was 14% below what had been expected 5 years before. Europe in 2014 is 13% below what had been expected just 5 years before. Japan did not come back, and the gap did not close. And my fear is that on the current trajectory, Europe will not either. What does this have to do with? Next slide shows a very important, and I would argue quite deep, structural trend in the world economy. This is not my calculation, it's Mervyn King's. Many others have done quite similar calculations. The world real interest rate has been declining for close to a generation. Why? More savings coming from developing world, more savings coming from more inequality, less investment coming from from cheaper capital goods, less investment coming from changed technology, less investment coming from less population growth. Many, many different factors have created a situation where normal real interest rates have declined very sharply. Here's the problem. If you have essentially no inflation and nominal interest rates can't fall below zero, you can't get, through monetary policies, interest rates to a place where you will have adequate demand to put everybody to work. Even if you could get interest rates down, there is the danger, manifest in the United States in 2005 to 2007, that the interest rates that are low enough to drive demand satisfactorily are so low as to make bubbles in asset markets inevitable. If you regulate with some kind of macro prudential to stop everybody from lending, then the interest rates don't do their work, and interest rates have to be even lower. And so the fundamental question that arises in the industrial world as currently structured is this: is adequate growth with financial stability and non-inflated asset values possible? And it is not clear to me that as our economies are currently structured, the answer to that question is yes. If that growth needs to be stimulated, the natural way to stimulate that growth is through doing everything you can to promote investment, recognizing that a moment when real interest rates are zero is a moment when all kinds of investments, all kinds of pulling forward of spending are extraordinarily attractive. That's why I've been stressing for some time now the central importance of infrastructure investment. Similar things can be said about removing barriers of different kinds in different countries to private investment as well. And this week saw a remarkable event. The International Monetary Fund, the bastion of fiscal rectitude, not some Keynesian professor at a New England university. The International Monetary Fund, you know, those austerity police, the famous International Monetary Fund, declared, get this, one, that infrastructure investment paid off 3-to-1 in terms of GDP, if properly selected. 2, that infrastructure investment was more stimulative if it was debt financed than if it was financed by cutting other spending or by raising taxes. And 3, that it would reduce debt burdens. Let me say that again, that it would reduce debt burdens. In fact, the IMF said that a 1% of GDP increase in infrastructure investment sustained for 5 years would reduce the debt to GDP ratio by 7%. There is something that approaches a free lunch in an economy in a liquidity trap plagued by secular stagnation. It is a prudent program both to promote public investment and to stimulate private investment. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that magisterial opening, which if there's anyone in the room who did not read Larry's comment in the Financial Times on Monday, I recommend it heartily. It summarizes it very well, including the free lunch line. Go forth and build bridges and roads and everything else. Or if you're in Japan, concrete the riverbeds. But before we come back and discuss that issue, because I would like to talk about the infrastructure more and the degree to which you think it can or cannot actually be effectively rolled out in the current political structures, I'd like to turn to Jean-Claude and ask, firstly, would you agree that the West is facing secular stagnation, to use the phrase which Larry did not use very carefully, but secular stagnation captures what he's been talking about? And do you agree that infrastructure spending is one way to get out of it? Or would you prefer to say use super loose quantitative easing or monetary policy instead?
Well, I had prepared to respond to a question on monetary policy,
Okay.
but I'm more than happy to comment on.
Well, maybe we can work backwards and you
for
tell us whether QE is going to get Eurozone out of the crisis.
Yeah.
There we go.
But for a few seconds on Larry's remark, first of all, he's the cleverest people I know and professor I know. So in what he says, I have to say I agree with quite a lot, and I'm impressed by his synthetic capacity. Second, it seems to me that some of the conclusions are probably right if applied to the right countries, if applied to the right entities. And in my understanding, the IMF says that. It doesn't say everybody has to apply the same rule. Of course, there is some kind of differentiation. Now, there is one point on which I have a difficulty to square totally the circle. It is when the idea is the advanced economy are dramatically lacking demand. Because I will give you, Larry, only the current account deficit of a number of advanced economy as is perceived for 14 and 15, according to the same IMF. United States of America, minus 2.5, minus 2.6 of the GDP. Canada, minus 2.7, minus 2.5. Australia, minus 3.7, minus 3.8. New Zealand, minus 4, minus 6. UK, minus 4, minus 4. So, I mean, if you really had a dramatic lack of demand, we should not have the obligation of this country to ask the rest of the world to finance their investment or to finance their consumption and their investment. So I have a difficult, I agree that your reasoning could be right on the euro area. At the very moment we are speaking, the euro area is posting a current account surplus, and it is doubtful that it is exactly appropriate in the present circumstances. I would be personally more happy with 0 than with 2.2 or 2.5. But again, I mean, we have a problem to understand better what's behind. I don't disagree at all, of course, on the fact that we were much too optimistic in the past as regards our growth potential, and that we have to do all what we can, I mean the advanced economy, to redress the growth potential. And of course, you will not be surprised that I would suggest more than more spendings, perhaps structural reforms as energetically and I would say particularly in Europe and in Japan, because I trust that one of the competitive advantage of the US is precisely that it is an economy which is much more flexible, obviously. Now, if I can turn for 1 second to monetary policy.
Well, more than 1 second, because I
more
think
than 1 second.
the question of whether the Eurozone can find growth via monetary policy with or without structural reform, particularly without structural reform, is critical.
Yeah. First of all, the ECB, it seems to me, has a policy, a monetary policy, which is currently underestimated as regard its boldness by, I would say, the global observers. Because what is really remarkable is that we have in the euro area what I would call liquidity insurance. So in terms of liquidity, one has to understand that all commercial banks in Europe can have the liquidity they need at any moment. It might be, interrupted at a certain moment or stopped by the ECB, but at the moment I'm speaking, they have all the liquidity they want. So in terms of insurance, it is very big. They could have 1 trillion more, 2 trillion more euros. We could see that when there has been the LTRO 3 years, you remember there was €1 trillion more that came in the banks in terms of reserves and was in the balance sheet of the ECB. So this insurance policy is there, it exists. And we have also another liquidity insurance, which is the OMT coming after the SMP, which says if you have the appropriate conditionality, you will be helped by both, by the way, the governments and by the ECB. The combination of what I would call liquidity insurance 1 and liquidity insurance 2, on top of all the conventional policies and what I would call the credit easing, which the ECB is practicing, explains why the interest rates in Europe are, say, around 145 basis points below the interest rate of the US if you take the risk-free benchmark, which is the Bund. But even Spain is refinancing itself a little bit below the United States of America. And in my opinion, you cannot explain that only by conventional policies. If you had only zero rates and even the negative, which is something that I have to mention also, the negative deposit rate to confirm that what is really the will of the ECB is to have interest rates as low as possible. But if we had only that, it would be impossible to have these results in terms of the benchmark yield curve. So my understanding is that it would probably be a mistake to consider that the ECB alone can deliver what everybody is expecting, namely a better level of inflation and, of course, a better level of growth. I think that what is really to be fully understood is that to explain the problem we have, the countries in Europe and the economies that have a big level of competitiveness, the highest ever since a very long period of time, and there are some, those who have an extraordinarily accommodating financial environment, monetary and financial environment, are, for reasons that are very complex until now, not picking up. The domestic demand is insufficient, obviously. And I would say, paradoxically, perhaps for the regular European language or central bank language, national inflation is too low. It's true. To give you only one example, in Germany, in the 40 years before the euro, average yearly inflation was around 2.9%, 40 years before the euro. Since the euro, it's around 1.5%, and today, as everybody knows, it's even lower than 1%. So around 3% in the 40 years before the euro, 1% now. It's not the normal behavior of this economy. So my own explanation is probably, in my view, that the cost of reunification in Germany, the cost in terms of unemployment, the cost in terms of imbalances has been such that there has been a long cycle which is based on moderation, wage moderation, cost moderation, which has worked extremely well and permitted employment to pick up admirably well, I have to say. But now it's probably time for another way of dealing with the domestic economy. It's not too much, in my opinion, the responsibility of the government itself. After all, the government has decided to embark on minimum wages and salaries, which was really a very big move. The Bundesbank itself is telling the unions, you could be a little bit more demanding, it could help a little bit. So I would say it's really the social partners, in my opinion, that have the key responsibility. It might be strange for a central bank, a previous central banker, to say that social partners are key, but I really trust that they are decisive at the present moment.
Right. Well, it sounds as if you're both painting a similar portrait of stagnation, lack of demand, but with different prescriptive policies to address it. I mean, you're focusing on infrastructure spending, you're focusing more on structural reform. Perhaps we can come back later and talk about, tease this out a bit more. But Bill, we've heard a description of America, we've had a description of Europe. You have the rest of the world.
Right.
Which, since you are remarkably adept and have travelled widely, I'm sure you are quite capable of.
Thank you very much, Julia. I'm used to being with these two good friends, but usually introducing them. Now I have this opportunity to go head-to-head with them. I've been waiting for that for many years. I would just start off by saying I think stagnation is a real problem in a number of countries. Obviously, as described by both of them, in the case of the Eurozone, Japan, we know that. I think, on the other hand, Jean-Claude's 2 points. One, the ECB can't do it alone. If you don't get some movement on the fiscal side in the Eurozone, and also a movement on structural reform in so many of the countries, Italy comes to mind because of Renzi, and France's, I think, necessity to really move on that. Talking about the rest of the world, the so-called emerging markets, the developed world, I am very concerned for a number of reasons. Number one, as outlined here, we see some form of either slow growth or stagnation in most of the major developed economies of the world. The U.S. is the only so-called bright spot, and even the U.S. has problems. But when you take a look at China, we became used for 20 years to double-digit growth. China carried us out of the Great Recession with their tremendous stimulus program in 2008 and 2009. Chinese economy is slowing, whether you want to talk about 7.4 or 7.5 or 7, it's going to be a real struggle. And we already see that impact on the emerging markets with the so-called commodity boom ending. And so many countries in Latin America and Africa, not to speak of Australia, have lived off that the last few years. That is running itself down. And so in addition to the slow growth that we're seeing in the major developed countries, the end of this so-called commodity boom, and this also is going over to oil and gas because of the tremendous boom in shale oil here in the United States, the drop in global demand, and I think we're going to see an impact not just on iron ore and the other commodities, but also on oil and gas. We're already seeing it in the prices. I think that the developed world gave a boon to the emerging markets by these tremendously low interest rates and this tremendous amount of liquidity sloshing around. Remember our friend Guido Montega, for those of you who don't remember, a few years ago, was shouting about currency wars at the Group of 20 meeting in Korea. He's the finance minister, still is, of Brazil. Now it's shifted the other way. As of last year, May 22nd, when Ben Bernanke started talking about the whole question of tapering, etc., we got our tapering tantrum. We saw the reaction then. The money started flowing out of the emerging markets. So Guido wasn't, so concerned anymore about it flowing in. He was concerned about it flowing out. And then we saw that again in January, February. And the Financial Times had an article the other day talking about this trade-off between commodities and what's going to happen with interest rates. And so I think we're going to be seeing interest rates eventually, led by the Fed and the Bank of England sometime next year, going to start moving up. It's not clear what will happen with the emerging world, but it's probably going to cause some of the countries problems. Now, some of the countries like Mexico have used this time to implement strong structural reforms, but many of them have not, and I think they're going to be suffering because of that. I think that another aspect is the uncertainty of the world we're facing. What's going on in the Middle East, certainly the impact of the Ukraine, Crimea. We see the impact on Europe, particularly Eastern Europe and Russia, but also on the rest of Europe. And I think that certainly what's going on in the Middle East is with ISIS, is having its impact. So the political dimensions are telling the investor in the emerging world that maybe he'd be better keeping his money safe in the US or somewhere else. And we're starting to see the flows going out of the emerging markets into the so-called safe havens of the developed world. Point that we discussed that I would mention here, and I'm not trying to give a plug to the Financial Times, but it was an op-ed of mine.
Please go ahead, please.
But it was an op-ed I did in August. One of my concerns when we talk about this tremendous liquidity sloshing around and the perception, Fed minutes yesterday, that this low interest rates are going to go on forever, is that I think you've had a tremendous reach for yield and a search for yield. And here we spent the whole 3-4 hours talking about what happened in the Great Recession, the problems of the banking system, the financial system, and how it got into trouble. My concern is I'm starting to see some of the same points in a different way come up for this reach for yield, a search for yield, and I'm really concerned that not enough attention is being given this by boards of directors, financial institutions themselves, and even to the supervisors, regulators around the world. So I think we have to be very careful that we don't get ourselves into a new form of what we've just gotten ourselves out of.
Well, thank you. Well, that's certainly a wide-ranging list of worries to worry about. And of course, the BIS has been very articulate in describing this reach for yield. I'm curious, though, when you look at this range of issues that are hanging on the world today, the secular stagnation, the problems in the Eurozone, the lack of structural reform, do you think, Larry, that it's a good moment for the Fed to be talking about raising interest rates?
You know, old Treasury Secretary habits die hard, so I'm going to basically duck that question.
I think if you were dealing with one of your students at this point, you might have.
Oh, well, but I'm not, so I'm going to duck the question. I'm going to largely duck the question. Look, I think you have to make a core. There's a kind of core judgment you need to make, which is the world's problem. I mean, it's much more complicated than this, and there are many different nuances, and there are many different sectors and many different countries. But broadly speaking, is the problem that too many people are lending too much money to other people who are spending it, and it's all going to go wrong? Or is the problem that not enough people are lending money to other people who are spending it, and therefore we're going to stagnate? And to get yourself oriented, you sort of got to decide which of those things is the larger problem. And one of the reasons why the debate's a little incoherent is that people try to be on both sides of it. And my basic view is that when you have deflation in Europe, something pretty close to deflation in Japan, when the break even on the 5-year has declined by 35 basis points in the last 2 months in the United States and is suggesting an inflation rate of 1.5% out a number of years once you take account of the risk premium, that with all of that, the larger problem is that there isn't enough lending and spending, and spending. So I agree with Bill that there's a certain amount of excess going on in the private sector, and you're seeing some signs of things that are excessive. But if you want to cut that off, and you don't want to make the Depression great here, you'd better be figuring out where else you're going to get some additional spending. And that's why I come back primarily to finding ways of generating public investment, and secondarily to generating private investment. There is no one in this room who is against growth promoting structural reform
Right.
that doesn't have major losers. But here's just a couple facts there are a couple aspects that I think fuzz up the story. It's still true that there are a lot of places where there's very important structural reform. First, and here's something the Americans in the room should ponder. In France right now, about 1 out of every 7.5 men between the age of 25 and 54 is not working. It's a lot. It's very troubling. In the United States, the land of dynamic and flexible labor markets, 1 out of 6 men between the ages of 25 and 54 is not working. And so one should not assume that there is some American model of dynamic flexibility that will work. In Japan, which is not normally thought of as a triumph of structural reform, it's about 1 in every 13 men between the ages of 25 and 54 is not working. And so it's not quite as simple as get yourself more flexible and you'll have a higher fraction of your population working. Similarly, we Americans are all about, we got our dynamic and flexible in Silicon Valley and it's all fantastic. In Europe, they're kind of sclerotic and all that. If you look at what's happened to the fraction of the adult population that's working in the United States and in Europe since the Eurozone got formed, it's better in Europe than it is in the United States. And so that should give us in the United States a lot of pause about social inclusion. It should give some pause that there's some really easy strategy of kind of getting rid of a bunch of these rules and becoming more like Arizona that will automatically produce more rapid employment growth in Europe. So there's a set of structural reforms that I think are right, but I think we just need to be a little less reflexively enthusiastic about just any old structural reform that kind of removes some rules, that constrains some companies, will tend to make things better. And by the way, if one of the things you're worried about is incipient deflation, some of the stuff that lets everybody dump everything on the market as rapidly as possible and the market find its level for all the things that are now overpriced, that's not all going to be necessarily fantastic for the objective of combating deflation. So I'm with the general program here that structural reform is the right thing, but I am somewhat more cautious about the difficulty of doing it and what its near-term efficacy is. Where I agree with Jean-Claude and Bill is I think it's a broad lesson of life, of economic life, that having bad monetary policy can screw things all up in a million different ways. But there are real limits to how much great monetary policy can make things be great.
Well, I agree with that.
Ultimately, prosperity in countries is based on the quality of their institutions, the quality of their companies, the quality of their workforce, the means of their system. And successful monetary policy will allow that to show itself to a maximum extent. But no monetary policy, no matter how brilliant, can substitute for a lack of any kind of entrepreneurial spirit, a lack of a trained workforce, all of that. So I think the caution around what can be accomplished with monetary policy is very warranted. Monetary policy is very important as defense. It can prevent catastrophe in all sorts of ways, but it cannot alone be a basis for prosperity.
Well, Jean-Claude, you've been given an unusual compliment on behalf of the French nation by Larry. So I would enjoy it if I were you, because it doesn't come often.
I do. No,
Maybe you can offer some advice to the Americans, perhaps.
There you go.
No, I have to say that during a very long period of time, I was more or less making the point of Larry. When on this side of the Atlantic, I was saying, look at the figures. The unemployment figures are not that bad in Europe in comparison with the US, and I have the net job creation since the setting up of the euro and so forth. And I was explaining that the better figure of the US were due to the participation rate, which has plunged since the crisis in the US, and which has augmented even despite the crisis in Europe. So that I very much agree, of course, with what Larry said, and let me only say that what it means is that all advanced economies have their problem, and the problem are very, very serious. And in that sense, we totally agree. There is another point where we would totally agree. I would only change a little bit the wording. When he says what we need is lending to spender people, I would say lending and with equity finance. Because if we only do that through lending, and this is the conclusion of the G30, then we will take enormous risk, obviously, in piling up debt. So equity is also something which is of importance, and we totally agree on that. Now, let me say that if all advanced economies have a big problem, it's probably because they are themselves in an environment which is extremely demanding. The emerging economies are moving very rapidly. Of course, we have the science and technology, which is also moving extremely rapidly. There are other elements which I very, very humbly draw your attention of Larry to, because I think it's a scientific problem which is not solved. Digitalization seems to engineer a reduction of GDP. When you take music accounted in the GDP has probably diminished as a sector by a factor 4, when the real consumption of music augmented considerably. But now it's bits, it's not atoms. And the bits are not counted because most of it is without any price. So there is a consumer surplus associated with the digitalization of the economy, which seems to me something we should work on, because it's a long-standing phenomenon, and it's probably underassess the real growth, at least if we would take into account this consumer surplus. So I mentioned that en passant. And when I compare the growth of the US and the growth of the euro area, I have to say, and try to explain the difference, which are big. According to the IMF, average 14-15, we have a difference of 1.6% per year of growth between the US and the European area, the euro area. 1.6. I would withdraw the demographic difference between the US and Europe, which is not negligible, might be around 1.7. Then we are at the level of 0.9. Most analysis on shale gas and the windfall augmentation of the GDP of the US associated with shale gas, which does not exist in Europe because of the fault of the European, maybe it is something like 0.4. So it will remain something like 0.5%. And I would explain this 0.5% with Russia and Ukraine, which is hitting a number of European countries much more than the others, particularly I have to say Germany. We have to take that into account, both in real economy terms and also in psychological terms. We have, of course, the lack of structural reforms, and I think we would all agree on that, even if they are not, of course, miraculous. And we have perhaps the other phenomenon that are of a macroeconomic nature or macroeconomic policies. But you see, we are more or less in the same basket. I am saying, with other words, what Larry said when he compared the employment and the adults at work. And so, if we ask the central banks alone on both sides of the Atlantic to offset all this adverse environment of the advanced economy, we are lost, because then we are exactly in Larry's phenomenon, where you have permanent, I would say, formation of bubbles which are pricked and then go again and again and again. So,
well, I think Larry's vision is that you either have a bubble, or you have a depression, or you build roads. You know, those are eventually.
Is that a lead into me? That's a lead into me, Julian, right?
But before I come to you,
That's right.
before I come to you, Bill, I'd like to quickly ask Jean-Claude, because I was chairing a panel on infrastructure yesterday at the IMF, and we asked everybody, you know, so which are the top 2 countries where you need more infrastructure spending now, and where don't you need it? Well, the places that people thought we don't need it are 1, Singapore. Singapore has enough roads, and 2, China. Controversial. The places they thought we do need it, as a matter of some urgency, is 1, the US, and 2, and leaving aside Brazil and Greece, 2, Germany, where there's perceived to be fiscal space and perhaps a need for infrastructure spending for wider purposes. So I'm just curious, Jean-Claude, I mean, if you accept Larry's point that structural reform can often have deflationary impact, and if you think that the Eurozone is hovering near the edge of deflation and that there is a limit to what monetary policy can now do you think there's a case to go forth and build a lot more autobahns and spend money on infrastructure?
First of all, I agree that market economy should normally activate domestic demand by spontaneous phenomenon in those countries that have a big current account surplus, a big capacity to, a big breathing space to activate their economy. And this is, of course, the case of Germany. Second, I have been living in Germany for 8 years. I am not entirely convinced that there is a dramatic lack of infrastructure, having gone everywhere in Germany, but at least they have the means to finance it, right, because they have 7.5% of current account surplus.
Right.
And to the extent that domestic demand in Europe in general should be augmented, because we are posting a 2.5% current account surplus, and that we have in a situation where growth is lacking and where inflation is not in line with our definition of price stability. All this makes the point quite clear that, for instance, the program that Jean-Claude Juncker mentioned, 300 billion, I would agree with that, provided it's done not wasting money, digging holes and putting the earth in it, but very, very carefully selected. And probably infrastructure might be more lacking in the US than in Europe in general, and perhaps if we could concentrate on creativity, innovation, R&D, and so forth, it would be much more, I would say, productive in a long-term perspective, because wasting money remains the worst thing to do, in my opinion. But again, I would agree that we certainly could also invest more in this fashion.
Right, thank you. Well, I'm going to turn to Bill. I just say on the issue of shale gas, I was recently talking to your former colleague Edmond Alfondery, who pointed out to me that one of the great problems in developing shale gas in France is that apparently the shale gas deposits do exist, but they're all under Paris and Provence. So the gods of shale gas have a sense of humour when it comes to France.
I understand it's along the River Rhône.
Right.
The couloir rhodanien.
So it's a choice of wine or shale gas. Anyway, Bill, I'm going to bring the audience in for questions in a minute, but do you have any comments from an emerging market perspective?
Well, I would just say that I think in general the world has become too dependent on central banks. I remember at Jackson Hole a couple of years ago, Ben Bernanke said, monetary policy can't do it all. I think that monetary policy is doing much more now than it was doing when he made that statement. And I know you were present at the time, and maybe Larry also, when he made that comment. And I think this is really a concern. And I think the fiscal side, as I was saying earlier, is not really doing enough. And I think that's something that's very important. When I listen to Jean-Claude talk about Germany and the need for Germany to stimulate more for the rest of the Eurozone, I think about China because, in China, the leadership is saying to the public, save less and spend more. But maybe we should talk about that with Germany and say save less and spend more, and maybe that'll help get the Eurozone out of its problem. Simply said, but I think that is one of the problems when you consider that the Eurozone depends, 30% on Germany.
Well, Jean-Claude.
No, only to react on that. I think we have two good reasoning. We certainly have German friends in this room. The first good reasoning would be that the union would say, as the Bundesbank has more or less suggested, it is about time to have a better augmentation of our wages and salaries. After all, we are now competitive. You are making money, and we tighten our belts during the last 15 years, which is obvious when you look at all figures. The unit labor costs have been extraordinarily well preserved at a very low level during all this period of time. So that's one. It's not saving less. It's having a little bit more dynamism in wages and salaries. And the second remark would be for the firms, for all those who are taking decisions as regards export of capital. Are you sure that exporting every 3 years more than 20% of your GDP abroad, you're not taking too much risks abroad? After all, investing in Germany is investing in an economy which is profitable, which is making money, which is reliable, which does not create problems as the subprime have created in the US, as Greece has created, and so forth. So why are you exporting so much of your capital? An arbitrage where you would export only 3.5% per year, taking into account demographics and the necessity of having pension reforms and so forth, correctly financed. But after all, 3.5 would be correct, and 7.5 is perhaps a little bit too much per year. That is a reasoning that my German friends accept fully. But if you tell Germany, don't save, do a lot of things, invest everywhere and so forth, they are not happy with that. And experience has demonstrated, after all, we have to mention that, they started with a very bad situation in terms of unemployment in '99 when we started the euro, and today they are about to have full employment. Not yet, but very close to full employment. So after all, their own behavior did what is the major problem, because after all, we are speaking of growth. But Larry was right in mentioning jobs. That's the point. And I was myself, in reading the IMF, a little bit surprised in the summing up that growth was mentioned 33 times, but jobs was not mentioned, employment was not mentioned, when we know for the cohesion of our society that with the same level of growth, if you have full employment, you are in a totally different situation. Totally different.
I think Jean-Claude is making my point in a much more eloquent fashion than I did. But the need for Germany to stimulate, I think that's a real key in the Eurozone today.
Well, I sometimes think, to make the point a bit more facetiously, that one solution to the Eurozone crisis would be to persuade the German Landesbank to build Club Med holiday camps in the periphery and give all the German pensioners vouchers paid for by German public sector to go and have free holidays out in those Club Med. And that way you get happy Greek and Spanish waiters, lots of stimulus, and happy pensioners who feel that their money's being well spent inside Germany as well, or by the German government.
There you go.
Larry.
Gillian, I think you're ready to be a policymaker with inspirations of...
No way, I'm just a derivative of you guys.
With inspirations of that kind. Look, another way of saying sort of what I'm trying to say here is this. We're all familiar with the concept of inflation, and we're familiar with the concept of repressed inflation. And when you have repressed inflation, because there's controls and corruption and whatnot, it's often worse than having regular inflation. Part of the problem we're having in Europe and in the United States is that we have a kind of repressed budget deficit. We are determined to achieve fiscal discipline and have some budget target, so we defer maintenance. You know, from the point of view of my kids' generation, it's really just as bad to leave all the highways unrepaired and to leave all the airports with inadequate capacity as it is to leave them with debt. Except actually, when you defer maintenance, the costs build up at a lot more than the 1% real interest rate that we're now paying on 10-year bonds. When you defer paying pension liabilities, when you defer investing in an adequate civil service. And so I think part of the way through here, because we're not going to, whatever Keynesian economists think, we're not going to persuade a broad public that a kind of live and spend for the moment approach is the right way forward. And so I think the argument can be framed in a broader moral term than focusing on the accountant's creation of the quantity of paper debt. You know, the way I like to put it in the United States is, are you proud of Kennedy Airport? If a moment when the real interest rate is 1% in a currency we print ourselves, and the construction unemployment rate is in double digits, if that is not the right moment to fix Kennedy Airport, when could that moment ever be? And it's not like it's going to go unfixed for 30 years. And so much better to fix it now. And part of what I think proper policy making in Europe would involve now is looking at a whole set of expenditures that everybody would recognize are going to need to get done in the next decade, and pulling them forward to take advantage of a moment when interest rates are epically low to borrow, to take advantage of a moment when labor costs are likely to be low, to take advantage in the era we're now headed into of a period where commodity prices are likely to be low, and do them at a bargain now, and in the process you can leave the next generation in a better place economically. And I think it's important that these arguments be framed in a way that's responsive to what is really the center of all deficit debates, which is the sort of obligations one is either meeting or not meeting to the future.
Right. Well, I think appealing for Kennedy Airport to be fixed is about as close to economic populism as you can get in this crowd. But
Gillian, you should try LaGuardia. That'll even improve your argument.
Exactly. Well, we've got a lot of brain power in the room. We have a lot of hands waving already. We have 30 minutes. So I'm going to take a series of questions. Please be very short and pointed. It would be courteous but not compulsory to identify yourself. Shall we start at the back over there? So you go.
My name is Frank Vogel. I'll be very brief. What is the spillover effect of all of your dire forecasts for the world's poorest countries? Bretton Woods Committee was created primarily to help the poorest countries through IDA funding. So maybe you could just comment. From what I gather, the outlook must be extraordinarily grim for the very poorest people and poorest countries in the world.
Larry or Bill, do you want to?
You know, there's two things. You're right that they ride with the broad escalator of the global economy, and if that escalator is moving slowly or not moving, that's bad. On the other side, as things have played out, the world's poorest countries are very substantially in Africa. And as a consequence, they are benefiting from a set of trends that are happening in the African continent that I think would lead a reasonable person probably to be more optimistic about Africa over the next decade than any time that I've been watching it. Now, you know, if everything changes with respect to commodity prices, Ebola, that could change. But I actually think that while there's nothing good in what we've been talking about for the world's poorest people, there are some other things that have happened that actually are surprisingly benign.
Unless you go to the next question. Okay. Let's see. Okay. Question there. Let's go around and sweep. Question just there. Yes.
My name is Martin Ethel. My question is simple. E-commerce and e-communication, digital commerce, is a major rising force throughout the world. It's also being invaded very heavily. It's got to be considered one of the risk factors. How much do you weigh it? What do you think the future is if we continue to let it go the way it's going?
Who would like to tackle cyber terrorism? Jean-Claude.
Only to say that it seems to me that it is one of the areas where we have to work a lot, not only from the security standpoint and the risks associated with it, but also because it's a phenomenon which is totally new that, as I said, has probably an impact on the way we measure growth, we measure the GDP, on the structural transformation of the real economy, which are gigantic. And I have the feeling that we are really lacking sufficient understanding of this phenomenon. I'm convinced that we are presently underestimating growth. This is a science fiction concept for me. Well, I started with Olivetti electromechanic. Chung, 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 chung. The kind of services I have from here for free is absolutely extraordinary, including translation in all languages and so forth. I don't see that counted in any of that. It's pure consumer surplus. But, I mean, it is more or less the same in your domain with, on top of that, all the risks associated with new technologies.
And it's not even an iPhone 6 yet.
Yeah. No, I'm very old-fashioned.
Bill.
Just two quick points. I think cybersecurity is one of the biggest challenges the world faces in the next decade. And I think going on to social media, I think the ability of social media to change the world economically and politically is really underestimated. And what you're going to see is you're going to see governments of the world trying to intervene more and more to control us. And I think that raises a real problem, and particularly when you combine that with cybersecurity. And I think it's really been underestimated, and we see it all over the world, whether it be the Far East, Eastern Europe, wherever, and right here in the United States. And so I think it's going to be a major challenge.
Right.
Let me make a different comment that will be relevant to some people in the room. And, you know, nobody can really know about this. I think one of the many costs of the financial crisis is that there's so much to think about from the financial crisis. There's so much to think about from the revised set of rules around financial services regulation that insufficient attention is being given by the world's major financial institutions to the prospect of their business models being substantially disrupted by information technology over the next 15 years. And what has come to retailing, what has come to distribution, what has come to important aspects of transportation, you know, my car, and it's just like a regular car you get at the store, get at the dealer, my car has more computing power than sent a man to the moon. I don't think that that's common to financial services. And, you know, financial services got a certain fair-sized fraction of financial services got revolutionized by the ATM, which was information technology, but it was a long time ago. Fundamentally, it's bizarre that credit cards work more or less the same way they worked a generation ago, given what technology has done. And you can say similar things about a lot of other businesses. And my impression is that because there's so much else going on, that my bet right now would be that a lot of the action in that, and therefore a lot of the leaders 20 years from now, are going to be firms whose names we don't know. And some of the great financial institutions that we think of are going to be thought of in 25 years in the same way that the Eastman Kodak Corporation is thought of today.
Right. We've got two questions at the table there. Jacob and one and then two.
Hilton, George Mason University. I guess this question is mostly for you, Larry. I think it's very easy to determine the low-hanging fruit with regard to infrastructure. You mentioned some obvious ones, but I think the deeper problem is determining what infrastructures for the future will genuinely be the transformational infrastructures. And in fact, a lot of countries are thinking about that, and they're all thinking along the same lines. And in fact, they don't really know, and that's what's holding back a lot of the infrastructure investments. This leads me to a larger question, which is that as a result of the restructuring of the financial service sector, it has become much more difficult to find entrepreneurial finance to grow the kind of companies that you're talking about, the companies of the future, because much of the funding and lending is going to companies that have an ancestry of being able to borrow money, and they're buying up all the smaller companies. The companies that have potential for growing are stymied in this new environment. And this is the larger problem, is that we...
Get to the question.
Actually, I don't think I agree with any of that. With
Okay.
any of the last part of it, with great respect, and I may not know, but and I'm going to make a comment from an American perspective, my impression is that there are all kinds of people in every major city who think they're angel investors, and that if you're an entrepreneur with some kind of idea, it's easier to get money than at any point in history, and that the world has changed quite fundamentally. A big difference between now and 1999 is if you got some great idea for some new version of Snapchat or something, you need $3 million, if that, to get it started today. You needed $50 million in 1999, and there are a lot of people who go $3 million. Well, if it turns out to be Facebook, that's $30 billion. That's like a 10,000 to 1 return. Well, you know, there's a 1 in 1,000 chance, and it pays off 10,000 to 1. What the hell? Why not? And so I think actually what one is struck by, and I spend a certain amount of time out there, one's actually struck by the fact that there are more dealers than deals. And I think there's a lot of money that's actually looking for ideas.
Yeah.
And so if you can't if you're a would-be entrepreneur with a technological idea and you cannot get it funded in today's environment, it's because you have a bad idea. It's not because there isn't enough money.
But the question I had, that's an American perspective. Jean-Claude, would you agree that's the case in Europe today? That if you are a entrepreneur with a great idea sitting in, say, Belgium, you're going to get bombarded with offers of cash?
No, it won't be the same in Europe. But I agree totally with what Larry said. And I also think, like Bill, that when you are in a universe where, as you said, there are more dealers than deals, you have a lot of money which is anxious to invest. It is a recipe for difficulty in the future. I have known several times such situations. Each time we had then a crisis. So we have to be very careful. But I think Larry is right. And unfortunately, and that's the difference between our two continents, it's not the same in Europe. You do not have this capacity to link money capital, risk capital, of course, equity capital, to good ideas, to universities, to clusters of brains close to the universities and close to the capital fund pool. And we should do all what we can to get that, because it's absolutely clear that it gives the US a big competitive advantage.
Yeah, just very briefly, I think Larry is absolutely right here in the United States. With all this, which I indicated earlier, with all this money sloshing around, if someone can't get finance, there's got to be something wrong. I would say part of the problem in Europe, and again, Jean-Claude raised it, is a transmission mechanism, in the sense that we have the more active capital markets, as the earlier panel said, less reliance on the banks. Jean-Claude likes to use the percentage of 75% of finance in Europe comes from the banking system. And you're not getting that transmission down to where it should be going. And I think this is one of the real challenges, I think now, and one of my hopes, that this banking union can actually function. Because that is a real disconnect in Europe, and one of the, I think, biggest differences between Europe and the United States today.
Well, that's quite a bold hope, and I hope you're right. Jacob, and then back.
Thank you. Jacob Franklin, JP Morgan. You all talked about the unemployment, which is of course a major issue, and the magic solution of JFK. I would like to make an observation.
Briefly.
And maybe put it in context, therefore. Of those who are unemployed today in Europe, more than 50% have already been unemployed for more than a year. Additional 15 or 20% have been unemployed for more than half a year. So we are talking about 2/3 of those who are unemployed today, their duration, as the way we call it, has been very long. JFK per se will not solve that kind of an unemployment, in the sense that the infrastructure that we are talking about is a solution for the unemployed of tomorrow, but there is the unemployed of today for which the skill set is so behind, obsolescence and all the rest. So let me suggest, therefore, to take Larry's idea of the infrastructure, but broaden it to include a broader concept of infrastructure. The physical infrastructure that you're talking about, the human capital infrastructure that is the training issue, and the financial infrastructure, which is the health of the financial sector.
Right.
You combine them all together, you have a stool with 3 legs, and that's the infrastructure that deals with the unemployed of today as well as of tomorrow.
Right. Larry, do you think it's time to redefine infrastructure away from bridges?
Yeah, you know, at a certain point, once you start saying that like a healthy financial system is part of your infrastructure, you're kind of saying all good things are part of your infrastructure. So I think I would distinguish between there's a physical infrastructure, there's a traditional infrastructure, roads and power and things like that. There's airports. There's a new infrastructure, wireless, fiber optic, and the like. And then there's a kind of intangible, semi-tangible infrastructure, which is systems that support the society. Look, that's a clue to give you my other favorite example. So I've been doing this JFK bit for a while, and as I figured would eventually happen, the guy who's in charge of infrastructure at JFK called me. And, you know, he explained how they were really doing terrific stuff.
Offer you a job or a commission fee or something?
And if I was just patient, you know, they were really doing stuff. I said, that's great. And then he said, you know what the real thing is? And he told me about something I actually knew a fair amount about, knew something about already because I'd worked on it when I was in the government. Get this, folks. The air traffic control infrastructure of the United States of America relies on vacuum tubes. Vacuum tubes, like in the old black and white television sets. That is the basis for the air traffic control system of the United States of America. And sometimes there's only limited capacity, like, it's radar, like the green, remember the old computer screens with the green dot, where it's all in green, like one color and green? That's our air traffic control system. So there are not that many people who can fix it. And sometimes they have more planes than they can keep track of. And then you know what the air traffic control structure of the United States of America, the three New York airports is? It's yellow stickies on a bulletin board. Planes moving, planes moving. That is the system. Okay, now, that doesn't make me feel all that secure as a flyer. It occurs to me that it probably wastes a fair amount of time. It does, people have calculated, waste a fair amount of energy. That kind of thing represents infrastructure. It represents infrastructure that they built the Bay Bridge in San Francisco in 15 months, and they just repaired an exit ramp, and it took 5 years to repair the exit ramp. So the issues in infrastructure are not just about money. They're about a lot of aspects of bringing things together in a complex society.
We've got
Can I just
yeah, sure,
say
please
what?
go there, and then Barbara.
First of all, on additional investment, let's be conscious of the fact that the US, if the US embark on additional investment, whether in infrastructure or in any other investment, it will ask the rest of the world to finance it, because there is a deficit of the current account. So we have to be aware of that. And in Europe, I have to say that we know by experience that at certain moment the rest of the world does not want to finance you. The rest of the world didn't want to finance Greece, and I'm speaking in front of the governor of the Central Bank of Greece, previous, didn't want to finance Ireland, didn't want to finance Portugal, didn't want to finance Spain, and didn't want to finance Italy. And we have experienced that. So I would say I'm in agreement with the additional investment in a correct definition of infrastructure, which would comprehend probably R&D and all what we just said, but only for certain countries, not for all, for those who have no problem in terms of, I would say, non-linear events to appear in their external financing at a certain moment. And this constraint exists, and in my opinion, it exists for all in the long run.
Except perhaps if you have the global reserve currency at the moment. But we have a question there.
Hi, my name is Bill Salter. The question for the panel, and it relates to all you've been talking about in terms of demand and growth, is labor. If, in fact, we build the next generation of infrastructure, it's likely that those taxis will be automated, the baggage handlers will be automated, the air traffic control will be automated, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We may have drones flying us rather than pilots. So I think there's a very large question on the table in terms of the next 20 years, 25 years, in terms of semi-skilled, sometimes even skilled, semi-skilled, and certainly unskilled labor becoming automated, and that has a very significant potential impact on demand. I was curious what your thoughts were.
I think what you speak about is, to my mind, a substantial contributor to increased inequality. That it is a feature that it means that if you have a good idea, when your idea gets implemented, you don't have to share it with nearly as many teammates as you once did, which means that good ideas are less sources of prosperity for everybody than they once were, and are more sources of truly spectacular returns for the people who have them. And I think you describe a phenomenon that is hugely important in thinking about what we haven't really touched on, which is rising inequality. It's hard to believe the right idea is to slow down technical progress, but it is going to take a large number of adaptations. And what I am struck by, without fully knowing the answer, is that there is an enormous amount of valuable work in all our societies to do, for which there may not be a highly viable business model in current institutions. Taking care of the aged, educating the very young, to take just two kinds of examples. And I think we are going to need to develop the institutions as a society that are going to help find work for everybody, because there's going to be a large part of our traditional economy that is going to go through a transition like agriculture went through, where basically you can produce all that's necessary with many fewer people. And so the people who were doing it before can go do something else. But then the question is, how does that happen? And anyone who thinks that's easy should ponder the fact that in the United States or in northern part of Europe, that transition had mostly happened 50 years ago. And all of our governments still have major agricultural supports and still have all kinds of, to an economist, slightly odd kinds of agricultural protection. And so you raise what I think, if the question was not the next 10 years, but the next 40 years,
Right.
I think the question you raise is the most fundamental question facing our economies.
Yeah, I would just add, Julian, I agree with Larry. I think that, historically, every wave of innovation has caused a fear of mass unemployment in various sectors of the economy. And here we are today talking about a lot of unemployment in so many countries of the world, and you just add this onto it. And so I think that it's going to be a tremendous challenge going forward of how we're going to be able to keep innovating, which we will, on all these technological advances, but be able to also handle the problem of unemployment, which I think the politicians really haven't grasped yet, because we're still trying to get out in so many countries of the Great Recession.
Well, also because it raises big questions about redistribution of prosperity,
Exactly.
which is something of a dirty word in a country like America.
Redistribution of wealth.
Yeah, redistribution of wealth is something which has not been tackled head on, but of course is going to be a big issue going forward. Barbara. I think you need a microphone.
Sorry.
If you can introduce yourself.
Barbara Novick with BlackRock. I'd like any or all of you to address, just in different countries, the issue of longevity, right? So we have a growing number of people who are living longer. It has implications even if we had full employment, but especially with unemployment. And how are we going to pay for all these entitlements, take care of the aged? Yeah, how do you see that playing out given what's happening right now?
If I may, this is one of the three major problems of our societies, and one of the most difficult ones, because each time you are asking contributions to be raised, each time you have to explain your people that to be sure that everything is funded correctly, you have to ask more immediately. They are all infuriated, even if it is the simplest thing to explain. You will live longer, so we have to care for the financing of the pensions. And I am struck by the fact that in each society, each company, when you touch that, you're sure that you have an immense upheaval of the employees or of the fellow citizens, if I may. And this is one of the problems we have on top of our competition of India and China, to oversimplify, and the technology which is changing. All this puts our fellow citizens under a burden, and they say more or less confusedly, both in the US, in Europe, everywhere, they say it goes too fast. We don't ask technology to move so rapidly. We don't ask to live much longer. It was not, something that we really decided ourselves. It's the progress of technology and of the health system. And we didn't ask for China and India to eliminate our own rent of, I would say, the first to industrialize. And I'm struck by something which I draw your attention to. We have exactly the same phenomenon in the US and in Europe, uneasiness vis-à-vis authorities in general. I was computing the popularity of the Congress in the US in comparison with popularity of the national assemblies in Europe. It's exactly the same level, extremely low, very abnormally low.
And getting lower.
The same for the executive branches, the same. And of course you have the Tea Party, you have the equivalent, which are the extremists in the UK, in continental Europe. So we have to know that we are living a very difficult period for our fellow citizens. That's true. And what you said is part of it.
Barbara, I think I agree with everything Jean-Claude said. I would just make two remarks on your question. One, more than once I've had the experience of talking with a major CEO, financial service company most recently, who was saying, this entitlements problem is really easy. What we just need to do is raise the retirement age, and life expectancy is longer, we just need to raise the retirement age. And each time I hear that, I respond, gee, that's really interesting. How many people at your company are there who are over 65? Oh, well, we really got to contain costs and stay dynamic and innovative, so I guess we've got 3 people, but they're kind of special exceptions. So there's a problem, which is kind of making the whole thing square. The second thing, and if you haven't looked at it, there's a paper by Barry Bosworth at Brookings that does this, that deserves much more attention than it's gotten. The data on how much the increase in life expectancy is a phenomenon of the upper half of the population is stunning. Yeah. Life expectancy for the upper half of 50-year-old men by income is up by about 6 years over some interval in the United States, and it's about 1 year for people in the lower half of the population. So these plans that involve raising ages and so forth are actually highly perverse in their distributional consequences, and we have not fully reckoned with the extent. And by the way, when one thinks about the phenomenon of rising inequality, it's kind of one thing to say that some people get to have second houses and other people don't. It's another thing to say that some people really get a lot of time with their grandchildren and other people don't. And it's a very big issue that's coming.
Well, sadly, very sadly, we are out of time now. The good news is that we've spent 90 minutes having a very lively debate, and we've not once mentioned the word banking crisis or CDO, and that's progress. The bad news is that we've heard of a lot of other issues which are very significant, very challenging. I would say there is a rough agreement in terms of describing the current state of the world, but there are obviously some significant differences in terms of the prescriptions offered, and it's going to be interesting to see how these are teased out in the coming days. But thank you very much indeed for a lively discussion. Thank you to the audience for such short, pointed questions and comments. And best of luck to all of you in trying to figure out the answers. So thank you.